I will. I'm going to skip a chapter, thankfully for you. As you can see, I've really tried to do this Gothic style in the language. It's really overcooked, and I'm very vulnerable to criticism for that. It's very unmodern. It's somewhat labored, maybe. I don't know. Oh, what did I do?
Oh.
So, uh, but I've tried to make it just fit the mood of the piece and fit the subject of the piece. September 28th, 1849. Now, this is the week. This is the beginning of the week where Poe is missing. Yeah, the chapter is entitled An Innate and Primitive Principle of Human Action. There are 1,000 paths that lead to death. In fact, it is undeniable that every small step a man takes leads inexorably towards that unavoidable ending. We might endeavor to delay that destiny by prudence and caution. We might delay our destiny with the intercession of He who rules the universe. Even then, though, He may grant us respite from our fate, even the Almighty cannot give a full pardon. The law is immutable. The grave awaits, and even the saints must plunge into that abyss. Still, it is certain that there are choices made, turns taken, that may hasten that appointment. How many ill-guided decisions did I make that week in Baltimore? No doubt there were many. Had I stayed in New York, ignoring the summons, would the ending have been less tragic? Whatever the curiosities of fate, I stood there on the Lee Street wharf of Baltimore. The ramshackle construction creaked its way out over shallow water and mud, with the pilings and the warp planks running parallel to the street. Traffic was building in the early afternoon as the steamer Pocahontas, already hours overdue from Richmond, when it finally moored. Low clouds bubbled over the 3- and 4-story frame and brick buildings on the waterfront. The air was thick with the smells of dead fish, live pigs, the stench of human sweat, and the noisome miasma of a crowd's breath by the time the last lines were secured. I attempted to stay back unnoticed, away from the push and the shove of the mob. The first person off the steamer was wrapped in a canvas shroud and carried down the gangplank by 4 ill-colored crewmen. Anxious to get the corpse off the steamer, they moved quickly. Judging from their efforts, for they bore it as a trifle between them, their burden was light. There was a soft thud as, without ceremony, the men dropped the pallet no more than 6 steps from the bottom of the way. The crowd on the dock stepped back to let the men deposit the sad baggage. One man even momentarily removed his hat. But when the sailors turned and retraced their steps up the way and back onto the ship, the people closed in again at the foot of the plank. Death was just one more piece of baggage on the wharf. The scudding clouds chose that moment to release their rain. I scanned the faces of the passengers as they began to disembark. A woman in a soiled bonnet carrying one child with 2 other coughing children at her skirts hurried down and away from the mooring. 2 or 3 gentlemen of moderate means, judging from their hats and vests, hurried along behind her, clutching their valises. Then a group of laborers, white men of course, wearing dungarees and plain-stitched shirts under long mud-spattered greatcoats, scurried off the boat, pulling up their collars and adjusting the brims of their ill-sorted wide-brimmed hats as the rain began to grow heavier. A few chattering Negro men scampered off the ship's stern, down the quay. Stepping back under the shelter of a tattered sail awning near the wharfmaster's shed, I watched the remainder of the steamer's patrons descend into the thinning crowd. An old man with a hacking cough, and 2 hooded women, just a hint of them there, then gone. One in white, the other in black, their faces obscured. A man with an injured arm, all moved with dispatch, eager to be off the smoke-stained ship and out of the soaking rain. I observed the reunions, handshakes, and a shouted greeting or 2 as people made brief salutations and scurried off down the short dock and into the city. There was no sign of Poe. Mrs. Whitman's visions had sent me here, and now I felt the fool for having been swept up into her hallucinations. He will arrive on the Richmond steamer on the 28th, she had chanted. Save his soul. Had I ever believed her, or had I only acted out of fear? I still denied my own dream. trusting in the superstition of her occult affectations, addled by the ether or disoriented by her touch, and made vulnerable by my failing faith in God, I stood there under the rude awning as water streamed off the canvas over my head, splashing off the pavement onto my dull boots. I cursed my weakness. I had journeyed from New York to Baltimore on a fool's errand. There was no Poe aboard. At that moment, a lone figure emerged from the cabin door aboard the steamer. Dark against the peeling white paint of the boat, he moved through the rain slowly, like a final tendril of smoke from a banked firebox. He wore a faded black coat and a cravat, filthy, but precisely tied in the current fashion. There was the air of an ecclesiastic about him as he moved to the gangway and on towards me. "Poe?" I shouted. He looked up, and I realized my mistake. The man was too tall, his trousers too short, the sleeves of his jacket of a length for a shorter man. He wore green-tinted spectacles with side glasses. He stopped at the bottom of the gangway and stared at me. I felt my tongue frozen as if by a spell. All time seemed in abeyance, even the sound of the cold rain faded. His skin was pale. I remember well the whiteness of his skin, like fog stretched over bone. "Poe?" His voice was soft yet clear over the staccato rhythm of the rain. It carried strangely. For a moment I was unable to answer him. My eyes broke from his, and I noticed his shoes. Though he was dressed in old but fastidiously repaired clothing of an earlier year's fashion, his shoes were of the finest quality, shiny and black with brilliant large gold buckles. They spoke of wealth and taste. "Do you seek Poe?" The man walked towards me. Looking up, I saw his hair was very long and pulled into a long Chinese-style braid that ran behind his left ear and then out of sight down his back. There was a feeling of wrongness, ill-defined, yet pervasive. As he drew closer, I caught the scent of tar about him, yet his face assumed an expression that could only be defined as humble and familiar. His hands were clasped around a leather-bound book with clasps of steel. In my mute state, I read the title of the book, gilded on its spine, Ritual Catholique. Poe. He stood within 3 feet of me, directly under the runoff of the rain streaming off the wharfmaster's tent. He gave no notice to the water splashing off his tall hat and cascading off the brim onto the shoulders of his careworn coat. "Poe? Sir, do you seek Poe?" I shook my head to clear my thoughts. "Yes, Edgar Poe. Have you news of him? I expected him to be on the boat." "And you are his friend?" The man's voice at that moment was so sweet in my ears. There was such an element of care and concern. Only on reflection at this later date do I associate the sensation of his speech with an overpowering perfume or a too thick, oppressively sweet flavor on the tongue. "Yes, I am Poe's friend." "Interesting. A friend?" There was a hint of surprise in his words. "I am Fox, Mr. Rennell Fox." He offered his hand. Taking his hand lightly, for it seemed fragile and wet in my grasp, I replied, "Pleased. I am Rufus Griswold." "Ah, Griswold, the editor, a literary man. You are familiar with your work in the world of letters, but of course, Mr. Griswold, all who treasure poetry and fine literature admire your keen sense of quality, the breadth of your influence." Fox's grip on my hand tightened, and he pulled me ever so slightly towards him. His eyes became visible behind the spectacles at such closeness. He did not blink, and the pupils were bright, some indeterminate color or absence of color. "Your reputation is of the highest standing, Mr. Griswold." His intense gaze captured me. Repelled and attracted, I felt some sense of the forbidden in the coldness of his hands touching mine, a stirring in me long denied. "Mr. Fox, you flatter me." I struggled with a pleasure I had not felt in some time. Of a sudden, he withdrew his hand and with a small cold smile spoke, "Yes, I do flatter you." "Sir?" Something had faded away. I found myself taking a deep breath and wondering that I had not been breathing. "You seek Poe, Mr. Griswold?" The rain had lessened without my noticing. Fox's voice had lost its humility. There was a chill in the air and in the timbre of his words. "Why do you seek him?" The rain stopped in that very moment as if some command had been given. There was a silence. The man's question hung in the stillness. A breeze stirred. I spoke. "Some Business. We have some business. I looked away from his eyes. The flesh on my hand where he had touched me prickled with some strange heat. Well, business must be honored. Fox almost laughed, a powdery laugh in his throat that only half emerged and then was sucked like dust back into his throat. You seek Poe? Yes, as I said. I had backed away from the man, further under the awning. The air on the wharf had grown heavy, and a frigid fog began to drift up from the fetid waters of the Patapsco Basin, leaking through the crude planks of the wharf at our feet. A shame. Fox turned and started away. A shame, he repeated. I beg your pardon, sir, a shame? I called after him as he headed up Lee Street towards the city's bustling chaos. He was met by 2 women and a servant, their faces shielded from me by their umbrellas. One of the ladies dressed all in white, the other in deepest black. I stumbled over my words for a moment, as if some vague intuition flitted across my consciousness. I dismissed it and called after the man, repeating, "A shame, sir?" Fox did not reply. He only gestured a half point of one arm, holding out the Ritual Catholique. The steel-clasped book indicated a pathetic, shrouded bundle dumped at the bottom of a now empty steamer gangway. I remembered the crewman carrying it off the boat. "Poe!" I cried out, though I knew there would be no answer, and I hurried across the wharf towards the abandoned pallet and its light, soulless burden. Poe! And that's where Poe enters the story. Dead on the wharf.